Today with Dr. Terry Smith. Terry is a political science professor at Columbia College and yesterday gave a presentation at the Missouri River Regional Library called Gerrymandering, Politics and Policy. So today we're going to talk to Dr. Smith a little bit about his knowledge on this subject and what kind of impact it has on voters and a little bit about its history. So Terry, thank you for joining us today.
Glad to be here, thank you.
So to start things off, can you tell folks what is your best short description of what is gerrymandering?
Gerrymandering is the process whereby legislative districts are drawn to advantage either one party or an incumbent by moving district boundaries around to either include or exclude certain groups of voters.
Now, do you believe that people are becoming more aware or sensitive to the issue of gerrymandering because we see it in the news quite a bit now? Or has it always been a topic among politicians?
It's always been a topic. The term gerrymandering goes back to the early 19th century, and it's been done by both parties everywhere at all levels. And so it is a practice that it's kind of to the victor go the spoils. Whoever controls a state legislature has the opportunity to shape district boundaries, not just congressional districts, but also state legislative districts to benefit its party.
Now, what was the crux of your presentation yesterday that you wanted to convey to attendees?
Well, first of all, what gerrymandering is, and then we kind of unpacked it into specific examples of how it can be done. But I also wanted to sort of raise awareness that a very significant Supreme Court case is likely to be handed down in June. Gill versus Whitford is the name of the case. That is actually going to, where the Supreme Court either is or is not going to decide that purely partisan gerrymandering is unconstitutional. Racial gerrymandering or other kinds that are discriminatory, specifically against protected groups, has been unconstitutional for some time. So the last holdout is purely partisan gerrymandering, where because you control the state legislature, you get to draw these lines to kind of keep your, if not expand your majority. Does that violate the equal protection clause of the Constitution? And the Supreme Court is going to decide that in June. What it looks like is that right now there are 4 votes that say it is. Those are the liberals on the court. There are 4 votes that say it is not. Those are the conservatives on the court. And the swing vote is Justice Kennedy. And it'll be absolutely fascinating to see what he decides, because if he votes that for the plaintiffs here, that is, in other words, to say that purely partisan redistricting / gerrymandering is unconstitutional, it'll be a landmark case. It will really reshape American politics.
Now, you brought an example. Could you hold this up? This is
Sure.
An example from an Arizona congressional district.
Yes.
And what you can see here is there's a thin little layer that allows them to have this be a contiguous congressiontional district. But you shared with us that that's actually a river that somebody would have to wrap
This
down.
is the northwest corner of Arizona, and what they wanted to do was to create a district so that there would be a majority of Native Americans. So on the west end of the district are Navajo, and at the east end are Hopi, and in between is the Grand Canyon. And so you have to have contiguous district. In other words, you have to be able to walk from one end of the district to the other uninterrupted without leaving the district. And the only way they could do that with this district was to basically run it along the Colorado River. So you can raft from one end of the district to the other, but that's the only way you can get to it.
And would you say this is typical?
No, this is pretty extreme.
Okay.
Missouri's really in good shape we don't have egregious gerrymandering here. The best state is Iowa, which has a nonpartisan commission that draws the boundary lines, and essentially they're required to stick to county lines. And so you look at Iowa's congressional districts, they're all real regular shape and actually more competitive than in most states.
Now, with how far technology's come, why not just go with a computer algorithm that will draw your districts for you and take the people and the partisanship right out of the equation?
That's correct. Absolutely. I want to use my software. You can't use yours. I want to use mine.
Okay.
So I'll draw those boundary lines so that I can maximize the number of districts for my party. You'll want to do that for your party, and so the problem then becomes purely political. Whose lines do we pick? Because you can program that software to do anything.
That's a good point. So we'll still have the partisan bickering, even if we're trying to use technology to do this.
Well, we do. And Republicans stole a march on Democrats beginning in 1990, because after every census, that's when this all takes place, and Republicans kind of identified those elections on the turn of the decade are the critical elections. So if you could control the state legislatures, or at least have a lot of influence on the process. And so now we see Republicans having more congressional districts than they've had since the 1920s, and in Missouri. And it's not just because of redistricting, it's partly term limits also, and just the Missouri becoming a red state. There are more members of Missouri has more Republicans in the General Assembly than they've ever had in the state's history.
This is a little bit related, but it's not gerrymandering. But you were involved in the drawing of lines for Columbia's 6 wards. What was that process like?
It was absolutely fascinating, and I was privileged to be a part of that. I did it in 2001 and 2011. And the challenge was the same both years, and that is you're going to have a central city district, but that district's population shrinks. And so what you have to do is expand the boundaries to get more voters or more citizens in there, because Columbia was growing at the periphery. You've got a hub and a spoke, basically, where
the hub probably being the downtown.
The downtown, and then you got the 5 other wards kind of spreading out from that. So what direction you went to pick up the residents that would allow the first district, the downtown district, to have enough people in it was the most sensationally political thing I've ever done, or I've ever been a part of, because people felt really strongly about that. They didn't want to move it into Benton-Stevens. And the Benton-Stevens people just had a fit when that proposal came out. Didn't want to move it north of I-70 because that problem there was that there's no community of interest there. Basically, I-70 is just a hack through Columbia, and north and south of that are different parts. They didn't want to move it, people didn't want to move it into southwest Columbia behind the library because that would have changed the nature of the district. It would have made it very difficult, because that's largely white, pretty affluent. It would have made it very difficult for a minority, an African American, to have a chance to get elected in that district. So the final draft, which was Plan E, ended up going west, basically out toward the mall. And that was relatively uncontroversial, and that was the one that ended up getting approved. But just to hear people, talk about their interests, but the politics of it were absolutely fascinating and really very strong.
So what is it that you would like for people to, well, I guess to back up a little bit, what do you think is the solution here? Or is there a solution when it comes to gerrymandering and its impact?
Well, the thing about gerrymandering, there's some wag has said, usually voters get to pick their legislators. Well, gerrymandering, legislators get to pick their voters. That's it's the kind of the comical inversion of the formula. So it really will depend on what the Supreme Court decision comes down as. There's 3 possibilities. One is that Kennedy will side with the liberals and say that purely partisan gerrymandering is unconstitutional, and that'll mean that all 50 states at all levels will have to come to a new reality and completely revamp their redistricting processes. He can do a second thing, and that is he can decide with the court that it's a very narrow application, and that yes, there was problematic gerrymandering in the two states that are involved in this particular case, Wisconsin and Maryland, and this only applies to those two states. Or he can basically say, look, we just don't have a good way of measuring what the problem is. They have this thing called the efficiency gap that some political scientists have come up with that sort of take into account wasted votes. I'm not going to get into the details because it's very technical, and it's in fact, I'm going to step out on a limb and say that Kennedy is likely to say we're not going to adopt this efficiency gap measure because you don't make profound, fundamental constitutional decisions on calculus that people don't understand. And that's what these efficiency gap measures are. So I think it can go one of three ways. My prediction is that Kennedy, the strongest thing that will happen is that they'll come up with some sort of narrow decision, and it won't be a landmark case. If Kennedy sides with the liberals, it will be a landmark case, and Missouri and all the other 49 states will be really between now and the 2020 census scrambling to come up with ways to implement this new constitutional mandate.
When do you think we'll possibly hear the decision?
It's June. It's scheduled to be in June. It's one of the last ones because it is so complex, and the court's saving it for one of their final announcements of case outcomes.
Well, do you have any other final thoughts you'd like to share before we tie this up?
This is just another aspect of that is kind of at a secondary level regarding American politics. A lot of people don't think about districting and redistricting simply because it's such a rare occurrence. And I mean, it happens once every 10 years. 10 years is an eternity in politics. But boy, when it happens, it really changes things. And because for example, in Missouri now, I mean, you've got a supermajority of Republicans in the state legislature. Well, part of that is because they control the districting process, and they have created a bunch of districts that are sort of Republican, kind of pink, not not bright red, and Democrats in Missouri and all other states tend to be much more concentrated and condensed into their voting districts. So a typical Republican district, the woman's going to win 58-42, maybe 55-45. A typical Democratic district, the Democrat's going to win 80-20. So that's where this whole idea of wasted votes comes from. But that's just the nature. I mean, it's how people live in the United States, and there's only so many ways you can draw those lines.
Well, everyone, thanks for tuning in and joining us. Again, I'm here with Dr. Terry Smith, gerrymandering expert and Columbia College political science professor. And we'll just have to wait and see what happens in June with the Supreme Court decision. So, Terry, thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.